Hello from Cape Town. I'm Matthew Kursich. I'm going to begin this talk by reminding everyone that the origins of HIV are inextricably linked to environmental destruction, deforestation, and the harmful intrusion of humans into nature. The HIV shares this common origin with COVID-19, with Ebola, and with SARS. And many of the underlying political, social, and economic factors that drive environmental destruction are common to HIV now in the spread of these zoonoses, and still underlie the driving factors that make populations vulnerable to HIV. As Pope Francis makes clear, nature never forgives. If you give her a slap, she will give you one right back. So how much damage have we caused to nature so far? Well, the temperatures in the world have risen by about 1.1 degrees so far. We're on track for a rise of 2 degrees by the year 2040. Throughout the world in 2019, there were major climate anomalies, all of which we contribute to climate change. Most of the discourse around climate change thus far is focused on the animal face of climate change. The bleaching of coral, the wildfires and environmental destruction in Australia, and the Arctic damage that we're seeing in drought and animals. But what I'd like to focus on in this talk, what we're focusing on is the human face of climate change. And here, I think we can consider 4 dimensions. The harms from direct exposure to high temperatures, classically in a heat wave. The changes in risk to climate-sensitive pathogens or diseases, the damages to health and other infrastructure, and the more insidious poverty and social disruption from drought, from food insecurity, migration and conflict. And we examine how each of these then impact on HIV prevention, treatment and care. We begin by considering the direct impacts of temperature on human health. And this is underappreciated, but as shown in the next slide, where we consider the health impacts of heat in South Africa, we show a marked rise in mortality as temperatures in the higher centiles. Many health outcomes show a very similar U-shaped impact of temperature. Even homicide in South Africa, when the temperature is above 35 degrees centigrade or 95 Fahrenheit, the odds of a homicide are 1.2-fold higher than when the temperature is below 20 degrees. But I think from an HIV perspective, the key impact of heat is on pregnant women that we need to consider. And during pregnancy, maternal thermoregulation is complicated. The fetus and placenta generate an enormous amount of heat. And during labor, the uterine contractions similarly generate a large amount of energy or heat. And maternal and fetal heat dissipation is very limited. In a systematic review by myself and colleagues, we showed that exposure to high temperatures during pregnancy is associated with preterm birth. During heat waves, the odds of preterm birth may rise by as much as 1.16. And even on hot days compared to cold, you see a 5 or 6% increase in preterm birth. The key question for HIV are HIV-infected pregnant women more sensitive to heat than HIV-uninfected women? And indeed, are there any impacts of climate change on mother-to-child transmission of HIV? And these questions we need to explore in future. In the second dimension is the impact of climate change on climate-sensitive pathogens. Almost all infections are sensitive to precipitation changes, temperature or humidity, especially foodborne and waterborne infections. Much of research in this area is focused on vector-borne infections like malaria, and how, as these extend in area or rise in altitude within an area, non-immune populations will be exposed and at risk for severe malaria disease. Many of the classic HIV infections, pneumocystis, cryptococcus, and listeria, the classic opportunistic infections, are also climate sensitive and increase generally as temperature rises. Also, some of the initial reports on AIDS, here's one from Uganda in the bottom right, from the late 1980s, which showed a seasonal pattern in AIDS deaths. And this may have been due to shifts in infectious diseases or nutrition patterns. But clearly, seasons and climate have an impact on the health and well-being of HIV-infected patients. In terms of climate-sensitive infections and HIV, I think the area we need to focus on most is the implications for TB control. Now, TB has a very strong seasonal pattern, which is mainly driven by transmission of the bacilli during winter, a heightened period of transmission in the coldest months of the year. And that is then followed 3 months later by a peak of cases in the springtime. So as the winters become more mild and as the summer season becomes longer, we will have less of these periods of heightened TB transmission. And therefore, it presents a potential opportunity for increased control of the infection. TB is also related to air pollution. So as renewable energies increase and the quality of air improves, we may also have a decreased TB transmission. And many of the lessons we've learned from COVID-19 and how to control infections could really be applied to tuberculosis control. Within climate change, we really have milder winters and improved air. We have a major opportunity to control tuberculosis. The next dimension of climate change I'd like to discuss is the impacts of damage to health infrastructure and the built environment from storms and wildfires. Here I give an example of Cyclone Ida and Cyclone Kenneth, which impacted on Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe, affecting around 3 million people, 10% of whom were HIV infected. The cyclone has been described as miles upon miles of an inland ocean extending with large destruction in health facilities, for example. The fourth area is around the impacts of the more insidious poverty and social disruption impacts. And here, I think from an HIV perspective, we need to recall that many of these impacts are really strongly gendered. Where classically, the most emblematic population is a rural woman which is very common in many parts of the world. A woman is responsible for producing food for herself and her household. And much of this is labor-intensive, rain-fed agriculture. And here the productivity is heavily dependent on climate, such that any shift in climate endangers this precarious existence. When there's a change or a threatening of natural resources, she may have to travel further to obtain water or firewood. One of the first impacts of climate change in these settings is male outmigration, where men may move to urban slums or informal settlements, areas that are hotspots for HIV transmission. One woman described her experiences as, "It's quite sad because we have continuously lost our hard-earned produce to erratic climatic conditions. Either the water will be too much and drown everything, or the sun comes and burns everything." And I think that this is the group that we need to really focus on in much of our work. So we've addressed the four impacts of climate change and how they can affect the mental health and well-being of HIV-infected patients, their access and adherence to therapy, and affect their sexual behaviors. The next important question is, how can we as an HIV community respond to these impacts? And I'd like to suggest 3 areas where we can respond, and 3 priorities for us. The first one is to integrate climate change within our existing HIV research programs. I'll give one example from South Africa, where the Gap Year Project, which is an HIV prevention intervention among secondary school pupils, where we've now incorporated questions within the surveys on climate change, assessing knowledge, attitudes, and what are the impacts in this group. And we noted some major gaps in knowledge and attitudes that we need to address with interventions. And going forward, the HIV prevention interventions will now also include components of climate change, behavioral and knowledge interventions. Really, the HIV experience has made our scientists and activists ideally suited for tackling new research questions. or tacking on research questions to our existing programs. And we've noted this with COVID, how the HIV community has risen to the fore and has increasingly formed a major part of the COVID response across most countries in the world. So climate change will become a major health research and program priority. We will confront climate change and reckon with this problem at some point, or soon in our world. And the HIV scientists and activists are well placed to tackle this issue. The second priority I'd like to suggest is that we need to develop and test climate and health services. And here I list 6 priorities, 3 of which I discussed briefly. I think we need to expand the scope of HIV counsellors and related cadres, so they include climate and health services within their work. For example, a HIV counsellor could assist a pregnant woman during a heat wave and help her to cope and advise her on cooling and other strategies. I think in terms of solving or addressing the climate-sensitive infections, such as tuberculosis, in particular, we can apply the lessons we've learned in the COVID-19 response to the control of these infections. The third area I'd like to highlight is around indicators for measuring climate change. Here, the HIV field has developed tremendous expertise over the last 30 years in how to measure health and inputs and outputs in a health system. And we could study the impacts, indicators such as those used to measure the health impacts of heat exposure, or we could design indicators that understand climate change attitudes and behaviors. These are major gaps at the moment in climate and health services. I'll give another example in the next slide, where we see the simple low-cost cooling interventions which can reduce the impacts of heat. Here on the left you see a health facility as it currently is, which is poorly resistant to heat. And the temperature inside many of these structures is 3 or 4 degrees warmer than outside. So if it's 37 degrees outside, it can be 41 or 42 degrees inside these facilities. And a pregnant woman in labor, with simple interventions like painting the roof white, the walls white, opening the windows, providing cool water, some greenery, and having an HIV counsellor to attend to this woman and make sure that she is kept cool and comfortable, could have a major impact on ensuring that labor progresses well. The second area, I think, to our response is during extreme weather events. There's some very good examples from the cyclones, Ida and Kenneth. UNAIDS developed a system where they gave HIV counsellors bicycles, which they used to move from area to area to distribute antiretroviral treatment and HIV prevention commodities. There were also mobile phone apps developed for using GPS tracking of patients to distribute antiretroviral treatment. Mobile clinics which focused on antiretrovirals and reproductive health. So while the response after disaster needs to focus on nutrition, on shelter, on adequate water, sanitation, HIV interventions also become important, and we need to ensure secure supplies of drugs and other HIV tools. I think to close this priority area, there's many unknowns and many research questions in how we can best deliver climate and health services. How do we ensure that communities are protected during heat waves in low and middle income countries or in HIV infected populations? And WHO has developed a climate resilience framework that builds on the WHO health system building blocks. But I think this fails to take into account the complexities of health systems. And the HIV community has grappled with these intense difficulties and challenges in delivering services. Do we focus on societal fixes or technological responses? Do we have vertical or horizontal approaches, silo-based or targeted, human rights-based versus alternatives, and silo effects. So I think the HIV community is so well placed to begin to tackle some of these complexities, which have yet to be faced within the climate change response. The third priority area, which I believe is actually of most importance, and the area that the HIV community can contribute mostly, is here where we engage politically with the topic and with climate change. We galvanize coalitions, as we have done with HIV. Our work indeed has never been apolitical. COVID-19 is not apolitical. None of public health, in fact, is apolitical. The HIV scientists and activists, we have decades of experience in building these powerful coalitions to tackle challenges. Can we turn this experience into the next big challenge that faces us? In this case, climate change. This is the year of 2020 vision, where the world confronts and has to reckon with its intrusion into nature in the form of the consequences of COVID-19. We're reckoning and confronting our systemic racism, our legacy of slavery and even colonialism. Is this the year when we finally reckon and confront the climate change which threatens our very existence? And our question is, are the HIV scientists and activists able to hasten and to bring about this confrontation with climate change and advance the field? One of the key contributions that HIV scientists and researchers can make, I believe, is to form this bridge between, on the one hand, the policymakers and politicians, and on the other hand, the climate activists. And I'll give a nice example of where we've done this successfully. In the 1980s, you'll see in the top left, Tony Fauci, the head of the NIH at that time. He had to engage with the politicians, in this case Ronald Reagan. And at that time, the right-wing government of Ronald Reagan, they did not wish to touch this, what they called the gay disease. But at the same time, Tony Fauci had to engage with HIV activists, and had some legendary heated exchanges with Larry Kramer, who passed away a few weeks ago. But it was this bridging that the scientists did between the activists and the politicians, and bringing them together, and this confluence of different communities that was able to change HIV and allow us to get to where we are today. Jim Kim puts this very eloquently when he says the unbelievable success of the 15-year coalition of activists and scientists was what resulted in the development of treatment for HIV. The absence of this, on the other hand, is one of the factors why we have been unable to respond adequately to climate change. The head of Greenpeace, she said that in her 25 years of having attended the COP, which is the annual meeting of policymakers around the world, she's never seen a larger gap between inside and outside. Inside meaning the politicians and the policymakers and a few scientists, and outside meaning the activists. So really there's an opportunity for HIV to bridge these two areas and advance the field. So as the last slide, I'd like to imagine the world as within a consort diagram. This is one of the most familiar images for the audience of this presentation. Essentially, we're all enrolled in this climate change study, all eligible, all 7.6 billion of us and future generations indeed. And we're exposed to climate change, to 250 years of carbon dioxide emissions. Nobody is excluded. But what's striking is that there's these two parallel groups. Some are allocated to high-income countries. And here there's high levels of adaptation. Air conditioning is ubiquitous. Warning systems and responses to extreme weather are highly developed. On the other hand, in low and middle income countries, there's low adaptation. There's very little funding available for responses to extreme weather, or for responding to crop failure or drought, for example. In red, I highlight areas where I think the HIV scientists and activists could make a major contribution. And if we do, we can alter the trajectory of this experiment that we're all living through. And here, I want to focus on our role in generating these global coalitions of health scientists and activists, which we've done so successfully within HIV, and indeed what we're doing currently within the COVID response in many countries. And these powerful coalitions will then threaten and tackle the vested interests in, and the politicians who hold back the climate change response. Key to altering the trajectory of this of the study of this consort flow is a just and a green COVID-19 recovery. But overall, a larger health sector leadership, I believe, is key and a central part of ensuring that the final analysis is positive for the world and for future generations. And in the final analysis, with sufficient inputs and effort from HIV scientists and researchers and from activists throughout the world, we can decrease greenhouse gases. And we will be able to maintain the world's temperature less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial time. We will be able to ensure that our high-income countries make their commitments and honor the accords that they've signed, and indeed provide financing for mitigation and adaptation in low and middle income countries. I'd like to close by acknowledging the co-workers and others who have given input to this presentation, and to note my conflict of interest, and to thank the conference organizers for this opportunity to present on such an important topic.